Now we are going to look at some examples of how we would use the different tenses, especially in an exam. So I've just taken a question from an exam, and we want to see how we can think about the different options that are available to us when we're answering from an exam. So here's a question. The other day we discuss the setting up of a debate club in our school. Okay, let's just stop there. So what is our verb? Our verb is discuss. Okay, now what are the different options of how we can use this verb? Okay, we know that we have 12 different forms of the verb, and I hope that you have worked to understand these different forms and remember these different forms. So let's just think about what the different forms are. Okay, so discuss. So past tense, right? We're going to just do past, future, past, present, future. Past tense is discussed, okay? Present is discuss, and future is will discuss. Okay, now let's just look at the different meanings of each of these. So discuss, the other day we discussed. Yeah, that would be fine. It's talking about a one-time action. But let's just look at all of them before we really choose this one. The other day we discussed. No, the other day is past tense, so we don't even want this present or the future. The other day we will discuss. Okay, so let's move on. Next, we have our perfects, right? So past tense, had, discussed. Okay, so the other day we had discussed, so it's talking about something that happened before the other day, like probably not, doesn't exactly seem right. And then have discussed doesn't make sense because that's talking about present and we don't want to talk about present. Will discuss, that's about future, we don't want future. Okay, so those are our first 6 options. Now what do we have? We have our ings, right? The continuous. So past continuous, simple. We're going to do the simple ings, simple continuous, then the perfect continuous. Okay, the other day we were discussing. Okay, were discussing. Now that makes a little bit more sense, right? Because it's stressing on the action, it's an ongoing action, and how we know it's an ongoing action is because this whole thing is talking about during that discussion, so that's something that makes a lot of sense. Let's just move on. We know it's not going to be are discussing because that's something that's happening right now, and this is obviously in the past. Will be discussing, nope. Had been discussing, that's close, but the problem is that, remember, the perfects are talking about something that happens before the time we're talking about, so I'm going to say no. Have been discussing, nope, because that's present, and will have been discussing, no, that doesn't make sense because it's future. So which one really makes sense? Well, I think this one makes the most sense. Were discussing, right? Were discussing. So we're just going to, put a were discussing over here. Okay, next. We move on to the second question, the second fill in the blank, which is talk. So let's read this. We talk about the club and how many students be interested in it. Okay, so here we have our second verb, talk, and we want to think about what are the different possibilities of this verb. Okay, so we know that it's past tense, right? So we don't even really have to say all of the present and the future, but if you have it all in your head, then you can just go through the order, same like we did in the other one, but just skip the present and the future. So we talked, okay? We talk, we will talk. Okay, let's leave those because this is still talking about past tense. Then let's go to our perfects. So had talked, okay? And that would be pointing to a time before this meeting or before this talk, so probably not. Then we want to do continuous, were talking, okay? And had had been talking. Okay, so remember, here our perfect is pointing to the time before, and we're not really pointing to the time before, so we're going to just take that out. And here also stop pointing to a time before, so let's take that out. So what are the two options is talked and were talking, and honestly, both of those options would pretty much be okay. But if you read on, it's saying, then we dash begin to talk about the rules. It seems like it's kind of an ongoing thing, so I feel like we should just keep it as this past continuous. However, if you put talked, that also would be technically correct. Okay, now we'll move on to the next one. We move on to the next word, which is be. Okay, and I'm not really going to spend too much time on this word because it's kind of talking about something we haven't really gone into yet. But maybe you can just think about the answer just like that. We were talking about the club and how many students. Okay, so again, we're talking about past tense. Were interested in it. Okay, were interested, or it's not are. Although I suppose it could be present tense. So are interested. But really, this is really talking about a possibility. And all of these tenses we've been discussing, like will, be, interested, these are talking about kind of absolute things. So we have these other words that we haven't really talked about yet, these modal words that would be would, or can, or should. So in this, I think if you just say it, you'll realize that would be would make the most sense in this sentence. So, and that's again something we haven't really talked about, so I'm just going to go ahead and put that would be interested. Okay, we go on to number 4. So it says then we dash begin. Okay, so begin is our word, and it says begin to talk about the rules and regulations dash govern the club. Okay, so what are the different possibilities? Now we are still in the past tense, right? Still talking about something that has happened in the past. And what are the words that we can say? So we can talk about simple past tense, and then we began. That sounds pretty good. Skip your present, skip your future, begin, will begin. Okay, let's go to had began. Okay, had is pointing to a time that's before this meeting or before this discussion, and it doesn't really make sense. Then we can say were beginning, which itself sounds kind of strange. We don't often say that. And then our perfect had been beginning. Okay, that itself is just really strange because we hardly ever use this as a past perfect verb. Though, I mean, we could, but it's just very rare. So which one makes the most sense? Well, I think began would make the most sense, right? Then we began. Why? Because it's a simple past tense. Were beginning doesn't really make sense because it was a continuous kind of an action. So we don't want something that they weren't continuously beginning in the same way that they were continuously discussing. Okay, so let's put began, okay, to go in this blank here. Okay, then we began to talk about the rules and regulations. Okay, so now we have our next word, govern. Okay, the club. So then we began to talk about the rules and regulations govern the club. Okay, this they gave you kind of a tricky one. Okay, now we can go through the different forms of the verb. Now, this is not exactly past tense, right? Because we began to talk about the rules and regulations that it's happening right now. What rules govern the club? Okay, so you can talk about governed, that's past. govern, present, will govern. Okay, so C, does that really make sense? That governed? No, we don't want rules that governed in the past. We want present rules. Will govern is not really right because that's talking about the future. Then we can go to our perfects. So that's had governed, and again, that's kind of pointing to a time in the past. Have governed. A little bit makes sense. It means it's something that started in the past and continues to right now, and will have governed. Okay, so that's talking about the future and something that it happens before the point in the future that you're talking about, and we are not talking about the future right now. Okay, let's do continuous is rules and regulations. Doesn't exactly work, but are governing. Were governing, so starting the past tense. Were governing, are governing, and will be governing. Okay, then we do our perfects. Okay, so our perfects would be had been governing, have been governing, and will have been governing. Okay, now there's just some problems with these words. None of them exactly fit because the sentence, the rules and regulations, governed, no, had governed, will have, the verb itself is a little bit strange. Now remember, I don't know if you remember this or if you saw it even, but when we're talking about simple and complex and compound, we talked a little bit about finite verbs, and these are all finite verbs because this gives us a very clear idea of the number and of the person. So they're very easy to understand if it's singular, plural, what time it is. But in here, it's not exactly it doesn't seem like a finite verb is really going to work. So what we can do is use an infinite verb. An infinite verb is a verb that does not really give a time or a person. And the two different kinds of infinite verbs are, or two of the different types of infinite verbs are infinitive, which is to govern, or gerund, which is governing. So it basically takes out the are, were, will be, had been, and it just uses the governing, and that in here would actually make a lot of sense because it's not really giving a time exactly, not really giving a person, but the rules, sorry, I wrote that wrong, rules governing the club. Okay, so you see how that makes sense? So every once in a while, they're going to give you a gerund or something you're going to have to put in there. So then we began to talk about the rules and regulations governing the club. Okay, next. None of us could agree, okay, and we'll just start now. If we talk about the past, could, agreed, could, agree, could, will, agree. Okay, can you see that none of this is really going to make sense with could? This is something else I'll be talking about. Could is something that only works with either present simple. It does not work with anything else. So if you say could, had, agreed, that just sounds ridiculous. So could, have, agreed, we don't even have to go on. So we can just pick up our present simple because could always goes with a present simple verb, and that is the answer here. So could, agree is the only one that would make sense here. And now we're continuing on. So none of us could agree, and we began. And so here we have another verb, argue. Okay, so we began. Think about our past. Argued. We began argued. Does that make sense? No, it doesn't sound right. We began argue. That also doesn't sound right. We began will argue. That also doesn't sound right. Okay, so remember how we talked about over here where we use an infinite verb, and I said there's two different kinds of infinite verbs, or the main two different kinds of infinite verbs are, or non-finite verbs, sorry, so you have an infinite verb. It comes with the word to, and it uses the present simple tense. So to argue. And then you have the gerund, which just uses the ing. So arguing. Now, honestly, both of those would be fine in this sentence. It says, none of us could agree and we began to argue, or we began arguing. Either of those would be fine and either of those would be correct, but I would probably go with to argue just because it sounds slightly better. Often when we use the word began, we use an infinite verb to go along with it. So to argue, so that's your infinite verb, okay? And moving on, finally, our English teacher, okay, so we have a new verb, dash, have, to be informed. So what are the different possibilities? We are talking about the past tense, something that happened in the past. So we have finally our English teacher had to be informed. Okay, that sounds pretty good. Have to be informed? No, that's present. We don't even need to write present or future. Let's think about past tense. So had, this is a funny kind of a thing. When you have a perfect past with the word had, you basically just say had, which we very rarely use, but we do use it sometimes. And it doesn't really sound very good in this sentence because it's talking about something that happens in the future. How we would use this is like, I had a good day before that. You know, something we would use it, but it very rarely we use it. Okay, then past continuous is our English teacher was having. No, the problem with was having to be informed, I do hear people talking like that sometimes, but was having is really focusing on like a continuous ongoing action, but our English teacher was only informed once. So it doesn't really make sense for this to be a continuous action. Was having, or what's the perfect of that? Had been having to be informed. Okay, that doesn't make sense because that's talking about continuous action that happens before that. So we're gonna just go with had, okay, because that makes the most sense. It also sounds pretty good. And it gives the meaning, the proper meaning to the sentence. Okay, had. And she, okay, so what do we have here? We have a new verb, come. Okay, come. Now let's think about all of the different possibilities. Past tense, came. Make sure you know your irregular verbs. That's important. Came, come, will come. Okay, we're talking about the past tense, so it's none of these. She was coming. Oops, sorry. We want to do perfect first, right? She had came. I'm sorry, she had come. She had come. So remember, that's talking to a point that's happening before this whole discussion, so that doesn't really make sense. She was coming and she had been coming. That's also talking to a point that's happening before this. So I hope you can see that really came is the only option in this because these other ones don't. Oh, and the reason why was coming doesn't really make sense. She was coming. It's giving this ongoing kind of an action feeling, and it almost seems like when we say she was coming, it's like she was coming during the time when she was getting informed, and that doesn't really make any sense. Okay, so we're going to take out all of these and talk about came. So came seems to be the best option, And we are going to put came for this. Okay. And break up the meeting. Okay, so here we've got our last verb number 10, and we want to think about all the different ways that we could use this verb, okay? So past tense of break is not braked, but broke. Present tense, it's still talking about something that happened in the past tense. You can skip the present tense. If it helps you to write it, just write it. Break, will break. Okay, now let's do the future of perfect. So had, this is tricky because you need to know the perfect form of the verbs. So had, not broke or break, had broken. A lot of perfect uses this in kind of at the end. Had broken up the meeting. Remember, that's pointing to a time before, and that doesn't exactly make sense in this. Was breaking up the meeting. Again, that's talking about a continuous action, and if we say that, it's really showing that it was, she came and was breaking up the meeting. It's kind of like she was doing this while she was coming, she was also breaking up the meeting. It doesn't exactly give a clear picture of what's going on. Had been breaking, that is talking about before the past, so we don't want that. So really, again, we're going to use the simple past here. Broke up the meeting. It's important that you know your past forms of your verbs. So we are going to do broke up the meeting. Okay, and let's read through it one more time, make sure it all makes sense. The other day we were discussing the setting up of a debating club in our school. We were talking about the club and how many students would be interested in it. Then we began to talk about the rules and regulations governing the club. None of us could agree, and we began to argue. Finally, our English teacher had to be informed, and she came and broke up the meeting. Okay, that looks very good. It makes sense. It's always important that after you fill in the blanks, that you that you read through it one time and just make sure that it's all making sense.